The rattlesnake's tail buzzed with deadly promise as Lily Gardner froze mid-step, her bare foot hovering inches from disaster along the dusty creek bed outside El Dorado, Colorado. The summer of 1876 had brought drought, desperation, and now death coiled before her. She dared not breathe as the diamond-patterned creature tensed, ready to strike again after its warning shot had missed her by a whisper. Still as stone, came a deep voice behind her. "I'll move it off." Lily's heart hammered against her ribs as she heard the slow, deliberate crunch of boots approaching. She couldn't turn to see the stranger, couldn't risk any movement that might provoke the rattler. The venom from a bite out here, miles from town, would be a death sentence. "Name's Yates Calloway," the man continued, his voice steady and low. "Don't you fret now. Been handling these creatures since I was knee-high to a grasshopper." Lily wanted to respond, to thank him, to beg him to hurry, but her throat had closed with fear. The rattlesnake's obsidian eyes held her captive, its forked tongue testing the air between them. From the corner of her eye, she caught a glimpse of faded denim and a worn leather vest as the cowboy eased into view. His movements were fluid but unhurried as he uncoiled a lariat from his belt. With expert precision, he fashioned a loop and extended it toward the snake. "Easy now," he murmured, as much to Lily as to the rattler. "Just a moment more." The snake's rattle intensified as Yates maneuvered the loop over its head, and with a swift jerk, captured the creature behind its triangular head. In one continuous motion, he lifted the writhing reptile and carried it several yards away, releasing it into the brush with a practiced flick of his wrist. Only when the rattler had slithered away did Lily's lungs remember their purpose. She gasped, dragging in air that tasted sweeter than any she'd ever breathed. "Thank you," she managed, turning fully to face her rescuer. "I thought I was—" the words died on her lips as she took in the man before her. Yates Calloway stood tall against the setting sun, his features carved from the same rugged landscape that surrounded them. His eyes, the clear blue of a mountain lake, crinkled at the corners as he studied her with equal interest. "Mighty dangerous to be out here barefoot, miss." His voice held no judgment, only gentle inquiry. "Gardner, Lily Gardner." She tucked a strand of copper hair behind her ear, suddenly aware of her disheveled appearance. "I was washing clothes in the creek when my boot got swept downstream. Foolish of me to chase after it without proper caution." Yates nodded, retrieving his hat from where it had fallen during his rescue effort and settling it back on his sun-streaked brown hair. "Nothing foolish about trying to save what's yours in these parts. Boots don't come cheap." He glanced down at her bare feet, then back to her face. "Allow me to escort you back to your washing spot, Miss Gardner. Rattlers often hunt in pairs this time of year." Lily hesitated only briefly before nodding. Her father had warned her about strangers in the territory, but a man who just saved her from certain death seemed worthy of at least conditional trust. Besides, there was something in his steady gaze that spoke of honor, a commodity rarer than gold in El Dorado. "My camp is just around that bend," she explained, pointing upstream. "My father and I arrived last month. We're homesteading the old Jensen property." "Jensen land," Yates's expression darkened momentarily. "Heard that place had bad luck." Lily lifted her chin. "We don't believe in luck, Mr. Calloway. We believe in hard work and God's providence." A smile ghosted across his face, revealing a dimple in his left cheek. "Fair enough." Though neither of those stopped old man Jensen from losing his cattle to rustlers and his life to pneumonia. They walked in silence for a moment, Lily carefully picking her way along the rocky shore while Yates led his dappled gray horse by the reins. "What brings you to these parts, Mr. Calloway?" she asked, curious about the man whose quick thinking had saved her life. "Just passing through," he replied, his eyes scanning the horizon with the habitual vigilance of someone accustomed to danger. "I was heading to Silverton when I heard El Dorado was hiring men for a cattle drive. Thought I might stay a spell, earn some money before winter sets in." "You're a drover then, among other things." His answer was deliberately vague, and Lily wondered what stories lay behind those three simple words. They reached her small camp, where linens and clothing hung from a makeshift line strung between two cottonwoods. Her missing boot sat forlornly on a flat rock where she'd left its mate. "Here we are," she said unnecessarily, suddenly reluctant for their encounter to end. "I'm much obliged to you, Mr. Calloway." "Yates," he corrected, the corner of his mouth lifting. "Mr. Calloway was my father, and he's been gone these past 5 years." "Yates, then." Lily tested the name, finding she liked the way it sounded. "I don't know how to repay you for your help." "No payment necessary for common decency, Miss Gardner." He tipped his hat. "But I wouldn't say no to a proper introduction to your father. Might be he could use an extra hand around the homestead." Lily considered this. Her father, Samuel Gardner, had been struggling with the demands of the land since her mother's death 2 years prior. Their move west had been his attempt at a fresh start, but the work was proving more than one man could handle. "I suppose that would be agreeable," she said finally. "We're about 3 miles north of town, just past the lightning-split oak. You can't miss our place, it's the only one with blue shutters. Father insisted on bringing that bit of Massachusetts with us." Yates nodded, committing the directions to memory. "I'll call tomorrow if that suits." "It does," Lily replied, surprised by the flutter of anticipation in her chest. "Father will be grateful for the help, I'm sure." With a final tip of his hat, Yates mounted his horse in one fluid motion. "Until tomorrow, then, Miss Gardner, and do keep those pretty feet in boots where they belong." She watched him ride away, this stranger who had appeared from nowhere to save her life. As his silhouette disappeared over the rise, Lily collected her washing with haste, eager to return home and tell her father about the encounter, though perhaps she would omit the part about the rattlesnake. Samuel Gardner worried enough about his only daughter as it was. True to his word, Yates arrived at the Gardner homestead the following morning. The early light caught the fresh blue paint of the shutters, making them stand out against the weathered timber of the small cabin like cornflowers in a wheat field. A thin spiral of smoke rose from the stone chimney, and chickens scratched in the dirt yard. Samuel Gardner was splitting wood when Yates rode up. The older man straightened, wiping sweat from his brow as he assessed the newcomer with a father's protective scrutiny. "Morning," Yates called, dismounting and leading his horse forward. "Name's Yates Calloway. I met your daughter yesterday by the creek." Recognition flashed in Samuel's eyes. "Ah, the snake charmer." At Yates's surprised look, he added, "Lily told me what happened. Said you handled that Rattler like you were on speaking terms with it." Yates chuckled. "No special talent, sir. Just experience and a healthy respect for creatures that can kill you." "Well, we're obliged to you, Mr. Calloway." Samuel extended a calloused hand. "My girl's all I've got in this world." The men shook, taking each other's measure in that brief contact. Samuel must have been satisfied with what he found, for he gestured toward the cabin. "Come have some coffee. Lily's just taken bread from the oven." The interior of the cabin was modest but meticulously kept. Bundles of drying herbs hung from the rafters, and handmade quilts added color to the simple furniture. Lily stood at the iron stove, her copper hair neatly braided and pinned at the nape of her neck. She wore a simple calico dress the color of prairie sage, with a white apron tied at her waist. "Mr. Calloway," she greeted him, a smile warming her features. "You found us." "Hard to miss those shutters," he replied, removing his hat. As promised, Samuel pulled out a chair at the rough-hewn table. "Sit, young man. Any friend of Lily's is welcome here." "Father, I wouldn't exactly call Mr. Calloway a friend," Lily protested gently. "We only just met yesterday. Any man who keeps my daughter from rattlesnake venom is a friend in my ledger," Samuel insisted. "Now, Lily mentioned you might be looking for work." Over strong coffee and fresh bread slathered with wild berry preserves, they discussed terms. The Gardners needed help preparing for winter fencing to mend, firewood to cut, a lean-to stable to build for their milk cow and 2 workhorses. Samuel couldn't offer much in the way of wages, but he could provide meals and a place to sleep in the small loft above the main room. "It's not much," he admitted, "but it's honest work." Yates considered the offer. He'd planned to join the cattle drive, which would pay better, but something about this small homestead and its occupants called to him. Perhaps it was the quiet dignity with which they faced the challenges of frontier life, or perhaps it was the way Lily's green eyes lit up when she spoke of their plans for the land. "I accept," he said finally. "I'll ride into town for my belongings and be back before sundown." Samuel nodded, clearly pleased. "We'll have the loft ready for you." As Yates prepared to leave, Lily followed him outside to where his horse waited. "You didn't have to agree," she said quietly. "Father can't pay what the cattle drive would." Yates adjusted his saddle, taking his time before responding. "Money's not everything, Miss Gardner. Sometimes a man needs roots more than he needs silver." "And you think you'll find roots here?" Her question held genuine curiosity. He turned to face her, struck again by the quiet strength in her features. "I think I might find something worth staying for." The words hung between them, laden with possibility. Lily's cheeks flushed slightly, but she didn't look away. "Then we look forward to your return, Mr. Calloway." "Yates," he reminded her with a smile. "Yates," she echoed, the name becoming more familiar on her tongue. He mounted his horse and touched the brim of his hat. "Until sundown, Lily." As he rode toward town, Yates couldn't help but feel that the detour he'd taken yesterday, the one that had led him to a barefoot woman, and a rattlesnake, might have changed the course of his life. For a man who'd spent years drifting from one place to the next, the prospect should have been terrifying. Instead, he found himself eager to return to the little cabin with the blue shutters and the woman whose smile had begun to haunt his thoughts. El Dorado was typical of the small mining towns that had sprung up across Colorado, a single dusty street lined with false-fronted buildings, a saloon doing steady business despite the early hour, and a general store where the town's gossip was exchanged along with goods. Yates had taken a room above the livery stable, and it took him little time to gather his sparse possessions. At the general store, he purchased supplies he thought might be useful at the Gardner homestead: nails, axe heads, coffee, and a small bag of peppermint candies that he tucked into his saddlebag as an afterthought. "Heard you're working for the Gardners now," said the storekeeper, a wiry man with spectacles perched on the end of his nose. "Interesting choice." "How so?" Yates asked, counting out coins for his purchases. The storekeeper leaned forward conspiratorially. "That land's had nothing but trouble. Jensen lost everything before he died. Some say it's cursed." Yates had heard similar talk in every territory he'd passed through: tales of cursed land, haunted mines, doomed settlements. Such superstitions were as common as dust in frontier towns. "I don't put much stock in curses," he replied evenly. "The Gardners seem like good people trying to make an honest go of it." "Oh, no doubt about that," the storekeeper agreed hastily. "Samuel Gardner's as straight as they come. It's just—" He hesitated. "Just what?" "There are those who don't want that land to succeed. The Jensen property sits on the only reliable water source for miles around, Certain parties would rather see it fail so they can buy it cheap. Yates's eyes narrowed. Certain parties have names. The storekeeper shook his head, suddenly finding great interest in rearranging items on the counter. I've said too much already. Just keep your eyes open, Calloway, and maybe your rifle loaded. The warning stayed with Yates as he rode back to the Gardner homestead. He'd encountered land disputes before, and knew how quickly they could turn deadly. If someone coveted the Gardner property enough to sabotage it, his presence might be more valuable than he'd initially thought. True to his word, Yates returned before sundown. The homestead looked different in the golden light of evening, more vulnerable somehow, yet also more determined in its defiance of the wilderness surrounding it. Samuel and Lily had prepared the loft as promised, laying clean blankets over a straw mattress and placing a small table with a basin for washing. It was simple but comfortable, and more permanent lodging than Yates had enjoyed in longer than he could remember. Supper that night was a hearty stew of rabbit and wild onions, with the last of the day's bread to sop up the broth. As they ate, Samuel outlined the work that needed doing before winter's arrival. First priority is getting that stable built, he explained. Snow comes early in these mountains, and we can't afford to lose any livestock. We should also reinforce the root cellar, Lily added. The eastern wall took damage during the spring rains. Yates listened, mentally calculating what could be accomplished with the materials at hand and what would require additional supplies. He was impressed by their practical knowledge and clear vision for the homestead. "What about the fencing?" he asked. "I noticed several sections down along the western boundary." Samuel's expression darkened. "Been mended twice already. Keeps getting knocked down, usually after I've moved the cattle to that pasture." "Wild animals," Yates suggested, though he suspected otherwise. "No tracks I recognize," Samuel replied carefully with a glance at Lily. "Could be someone's idea of a prank." Lily set down her spoon with uncharacteristic force. "It's no prank, Father, and you know it. It's deliberate sabotage." Samuel sighed. "We don't know that for certain, Lily." "Don't we?" She turned to Yates. "3 times now something has happened just when we were making progress. Fences broken, tools missing, our seed corn spoiled by water though it was stored high and dry." Yates thought of the storekeeper's warning. "Has anyone threatened you directly?" "Not in so many words," Samuel admitted. "But there've been offers to buy the land, offers that get more insistent each time I refuse." "Who's making these offers?" "Man named Victor Harrington. Owns the largest ranch in the county, about 10 miles west of here. Says our water rights are disrupting his cattle operation." Yates had heard the name, few in Colorado hadn't. Victor Harrington was one of the territory's cattle barons, a man who had built his empire through means both legal and otherwise. If he wanted the Gardner land, that explained the bad luck that had plagued first Jensen and now the Gardners. "Water rights are legally binding," Yates said. "He can't just take them." "No, but he can make life difficult enough that we give up," Lily replied, her green eyes flashing with defiance. "Which we won't." Samuel reached across the table to pat his daughter's hand. "No, we won't. But we need to be smart, Lily girl. Harrington has money and men. We have determination and faith. And now you have me," Yates added quietly. The words surprised him almost as much as they seemed to surprise the Gardners. He hadn't intended to take sides in a land dispute. Such entanglements rarely ended well for drifters like him. Yet something about this family's quiet courage in the face of intimidation stirred a protective instinct he'd thought long buried. Samuel studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Glad to hear it, son. But I won't have you fighting our battles. We hired you for honest work, not gunslinging." "With respect, Mr. Gardner, sometimes the line between the two gets mighty thin out here." Yates held the older man's gaze. "I'm not looking for trouble, but I won't turn tail if it finds us." A silent understanding passed between the men. Samuel might not want violence on his land, but he wasn't naive about the realities of frontier justice. "Well then," Samuel said finally, "let's focus on what we can control. Tomorrow we start on that stable." The conversation shifted to lighter topics as they finished their meal. Lily spoke of the garden she'd planted and her hopes for next year's harvest. Samuel shared stories of their journey west from Massachusetts, where he'd been a schoolteacher before his wife's death had prompted their relocation. As darkness fell, Samuel retired to his small bedroom off the main living area, leaving Lily and Yates seated by the fire. For a time, they sat in comfortable silence, watching the flames dance over the cedar logs. "Thank you," Lily said eventually, her voice soft in the quiet room. "For what?" "For believing us about the sabotage. Father doesn't like to think ill of others, even when the evidence is clear." Yates nodded. "It's a good quality in a man, though not always practical." "No," she agreed, "not always practical." She hesitated before continuing. "May I ask you something personal, Yates?" The use of his first name, spoken in her gentle voice, sent an unexpected warmth through him. "You can ask. Can't promise I'll answer." A smile touched her lips. "Fair enough. I was wondering, what made you become a drifter? You seem capable enough to have settled somewhere, built something of your own." It was a question he'd asked himself many times over the years. Why had he never put down roots, never claimed land or started a business like other men his age? "I was settled once," he said after a long pause. "Had a small spread in Wyoming territory. Wife named Caroline. We were going to raise horses." Lily's expression softened. "What happened? Fever took her the first winter." Even after 7 years, the words still felt raw in his throat. "After that, the land just seemed empty. Sold it to a neighbor and started riding. Haven't stopped for long since then." "I'm sorry," Lily whispered, genuine compassion in her voice. "That's a heavy burden to carry alone." Yates shrugged, uncomfortable with the sympathy in her eyes. "It was a long time ago." "Some hurts don't heal with time alone," she replied. "After Mother died, I thought the pain would lessen eventually. Instead, it just changed, became part of me like a scar that only aches when the weather turns." Her understanding, so simply expressed, touched something in Yates that had been closed off for years. This woman, barely more than 20 if he guessed correctly, had an old soul's wisdom about grief. "Your father's lucky to have you," he said finally. "We're lucky to have each other," she corrected gently. "And now, perhaps, to have you as well." The implications of her words hung in the air between them, full of potential neither was ready to acknowledge. Lily stood, smoothing her skirts with nervous hands. "I should get some rest." Dawn comes early. Yates rose as well, suddenly aware of how the firelight caught the copper highlights in her hair. "Good night, Lily." "Good night, Yates." She paused at the door to her small room. "Dreams be sweet." "And yours," he replied, an old response he hadn't used since childhood. After she'd gone, Yates climbed the ladder to his loft and stretched out on the straw mattress, listening to the night sounds of the homestead, the soft lowing of the cow in its temporary pen, the distant call of a coyote, the creaking of the cabin as it settled. For the first time in years, he fell asleep thinking not of the miles ahead, but of reasons to stay. The following weeks established a rhythm to life at the Gardner homestead. Yates and Samuel worked from dawn to dusk, building the stable, reinforcing fences, and preparing the land for winter. Lily maintained the household, tended the garden, and often joined the men in their labor when extra hands were needed. The stable rose steadily, a solid structure of pine logs with a pitched roof that would shed snow. Yates took particular pride in the craftsmanship of the doors, which he hung on hinges forged by the blacksmith in town. "Fine work," Samuel commented, running his hand along the smooth, planed surface. "You've done this before." Yates nodded, thinking of the barn he'd built in Wyoming. "Once or twice." As they worked together, Yates came to respect Samuel Gardner more each day. The former schoolteacher had an orderly mind and a patient temperament that served him well in the challenging task of carving a home from wilderness. He spoke often of his late wife, Catherine, and the dreams they'd shared for a new life in the West. "She would have loved it here," he told Yates one evening as they sat on the cabin's small porch, pipes lit against the mosquitoes. "Catherine had a way of seeing beauty in the harshest places." "Lily takes after her in that," Yates observed, having noticed how the young woman would often pause in her work to admire a sunset or gather wildflowers from the meadow. Samuel smiled fondly. "She does at that, has her mother's heart and her stubborn Gardner chin." His expression grew serious. "She deserves more than this hard-scrabble existence, you know. Back east, she could have had suitors, society, a proper life." "Seems to me she's chosen the life she wants," Yates replied carefully. "Perhaps." Samuel tamped his pipe thoughtfully. "Or perhaps she's simply too loyal to leave her old father to fend for himself." Yates had no answer for that. He'd seen how devoted Lily was to her father, how she anticipated his needs and supported his dreams for the homestead. Yet he'd also witnessed her fierce independence and genuine love for the land. She was no reluctant exile from civilization, but a woman who had found her place in this untamed country. His interactions with Lily herself grew more comfortable as the days passed. She sought his company in the evenings, asking about his travels or sharing books from the small collection she'd brought west. Sometimes they simply sat together in companionable silence as she mended clothing, and he carved small wooden figures, a habit he'd developed during long, solitary nights on the trail. One evening, after Samuel had retired early with a headache, Lily examined the menagerie of tiny animals that Yates had accumulated on the mantel. "These are beautiful," she said, carefully lifting a perfectly proportioned fox. "Where did you learn to carve like this?" "My grandfather taught me," Yates explained, working on a new piece, a horse with flowing mane. "He made furniture in Tennessee before the war, said I had the hands for detail work." He was right. She replaced the fox and picked up a bird with outstretched wings. "They're so alive." "Like you've captured their spirits in the wood." Yates felt an unexpected pleasure at her appreciation. "They're just a way to pass the time." "They're art," she insisted, setting down the bird and turning to face him. "You have a gift, Yates." Their eyes met, and for a moment the small cabin seemed charged with unspoken possibility. Yates found himself noticing details he tried to ignore: the gentle curve of her neck, the small scar above her right eyebrow, the way her lashes cast shadows on her cheeks in the lamplight. Lily was the first to break the spell, clearing her throat softly. "I should check on Father." "Good night, Yates." "Night, Lily," he responded, watching her retreat to the small room she shared with Samuel. Left alone, Yates stared at the half-finished horse in his hands. He was developing feelings for Lily Gardner, feelings that complicated an already complex situation. She was young, sheltered, and the daughter of his employer. He was a drifter with little to offer beyond his labor and a collection of wooden animals. Yet each day, the thought of moving on grew more distant, more difficult to contemplate. This homestead, this family, was beginning to feel like something he hadn't allowed himself to want in years. Home. The first frost came early that year, painting the meadow grass silver and hardening the ground. It was during this time that the troubles Samuel had mentioned began to escalate. One morning, they awoke to find two fence sections completely dismantled, allowing their small herd of cattle to scatter across the countryside. It took the entire day to round up the animals, during which time the garden was trampled by unknown horses, though the hoof prints led toward Harrington land. A week later, Yates discovered that someone had contaminated their well with dead rabbits, forcing them to haul water from the creek until it could be cleaned and purified. The incidents continued, tools broken, a mysterious fire in the woodpile that nearly spread to the cabin, and increasingly brazen trespassing on Gardner property. "This has gone beyond harassment," Yates told Samuel after discovering their plow had been damaged beyond repair. "Harrington's men are getting desperate." Samuel ran a hand through his graying hair. "I can't prove it's Harrington." "You don't have to prove it to know it's true," Yates countered. "The question is, what are we going to do about it?" "We're going to continue as we have been," Samuel replied firmly. "With dignity and perseverance. I won't be provoked into violence, Yates. That's what they want, an excuse to come at us with full force." Yates respected the older man's principles, but he'd seen land disputes turn deadly before. Dignity wouldn't stop a bullet or save the homestead if Harrington decided to escalate further. That night, after the Gardners had gone to bed, Yates sat on the porch with his Winchester across his lap. The moon cast long shadows across the yard, and an owl called from the trees beyond the newly built stable. He didn't expect trouble. Harrington's men typically struck during daylight when the family was busy with chores, but vigilance had kept him alive this long. He was therefore surprised when he heard the soft creak of the cabin door opening behind him. "You should be asleep," he said without turning, recognizing Lily's light footsteps. "As should you," she countered, settling beside him on the rough-hewn bench. She had wrapped a quilt around her shoulders against the autumn chill, and her hair hung in a single braid down her back. "Someone needs to keep watch," Yates replied. "Your father has faith in human nature. I prefer to trust my rifle." Lily was quiet for a moment, looking out at the silver-washed landscape. "He wasn't always so adamant about non-violence," she said finally. "During the war, he served as a sharpshooter for the Union. Rarely speaks of it, but I've heard him call out in his sleep sometimes." This revelation surprised Yates. He'd assumed Samuel's pacifism stemmed from his scholarly background, not from the trauma of combat. "War changes a man," Yates said, "makes some harder, some softer." "And what about you?" Lily asked. "What has life made of you, Yates Calloway?" It was a deeper question than their previous conversations had ventured. Yates considered his answer carefully. "I'm not sure I know any more," he admitted. "I've been running so long I forgot what I was running toward." Lily studied his profile in the moonlight. "And now?" He turned to meet her gaze. "Now I'm starting to remember." The confession hung between them, its implications clear. Lily's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't look away. "I'm glad," she whispered. Before either could say more, a sharp crack echoed from the direction of the creek, the unmistakable sound of a rifle shot. Yates was on his feet instantly, pushing Lily toward the cabin door. "Get inside and wake your father," he ordered, all tenderness gone from his voice. "Bar the door behind you." "Yates." "Now, Lily." She hesitated only a moment before hurrying inside. Yates heard the bar drop into place as he moved toward the corner of the cabin, keeping to the shadows. Another shot rang out, followed by the distant sound of cattle lowing in distress. Samuel appeared at his side moments later, a shotgun in his hands and determination etched on his face. "They're after the herd," he said grimly. "Stay here and protect Lily," Yates instructed. "I'll see what we're dealing with." Before Samuel could protest, Yates slipped away into the darkness. Years of living on the frontier had taught him how to move silently, how to blend with shadow and brush. He made his way toward the creek where the cattle were penned for the night, alert for any movement. He spotted them as he crested a small rise, 3 riders, driving the Gardner cattle toward the western boundary. Even in the moonlight, he could see that they wore bandanas over their faces. One held a torch, its flame casting eerie light over the scene. Yates raised his rifle and fired a warning shot over their heads. The riders immediately scattered, one of them dropping the torch. The dry grass caught fire instantly, creating a diversion as the rustlers fled. Cursing, Yates ran toward the spreading flames. The cattle, already panicked by the gunshots, now faced a greater threat. If the fire reached the trees beyond the pasture, the entire homestead could be at risk. He heard Samuel's voice behind him, shouting instructions to Lily. Together, they worked frantically to contain the fire, Samuel driving the cattle to safety, while Yates and Lily beat at the flames with wet blankets. It was exhausting, smoke-choked work, but finally, the fire was reduced to smoldering patches that posed no immediate danger. "Did you recognize any of them?" Samuel asked, his face blackened with soot as they walked back toward the cabin. Yates shook his head. They were masked, but they knew what they were doing. This wasn't random mischief. "No," Samuel agreed grimly. "This was Harrington sending a message." "We should report this to the sheriff," Lily suggested, though her tone indicated she had little hope of official intervention. Samuel's laugh was bitter. "Sheriff Dobson, he has supper at Harrington's table every Sunday. No, we're on our own here." The reality of their situation hung heavy in the pre-dawn air. The sabotage had escalated to outright theft and arson. It was only a matter of time before someone got hurt or worse. "There's another option," Yates said carefully as they reached the cabin. "You could sell." The words tasted like betrayal, but he felt obligated to voice the possibility. Samuel and Lily had worked tirelessly to build this home, but at what cost? How long before Harrington's tactics turned deadly? Samuel's expression hardened. "This land is our future, Lily's future. I won't be bullied off it. And if they come back with more men, with worse intentions," Yates pressed. "Then we'll face that when it comes," Samuel replied, his voice leaving no room for argument. "I didn't fight in a war to preserve this union only to surrender my legal rights to a tyrant with money." Lily touched her father's arm. "We knew it wouldn't be easy, Father, but we're not alone anymore." She glanced at Yates, a question in her eyes. He should leave, Yates thought. Ride out before dawn and put this trouble behind him. He'd avoided other people's fights for years, knowing that attachment only led to loss. Yet the thought of abandoning the Gardners to Harrington's machinations was unthinkable. "No," he agreed finally. "You're not alone." The relief in Lily's eyes made the decision worthwhile, whatever consequences might follow. They were good people fighting for something that was rightfully theirs. And somewhere in the weeks he'd spent on their land, their fight had become his own. As October yielded to November, a tense calm settled over the Gardner homestead. The cattle raids stopped, though Yates suspected it was less a surrender than a tactical retreat on Harrington's part. With winter approaching, the cattle baron likely had other concerns than harassing one stubborn family. The stable was completed just as the first snowflakes began to fall, delicate crystalline patterns that thickened to a steady curtain of white by nightfall. The animals were secured in their new shelter, the root cellar was fully stocked, and cords of firewood were stacked neatly against the cabin wall. "We're as ready as we can be," Samuel declared with satisfaction as they watched the snow from the cabin porch. "Thanks in no small part to you, Yates." "Just doing what you hired me for," Yates replied, though he knew his role had evolved far beyond hired hand. He had become part of this place, invested in its success and protective of its inhabitants, especially Lily. Their relationship had deepened in the weeks following the fire. She sought his company more openly, no longer manufacturing excuses to speak with him alone. For his part, Yates found himself looking forward to their evening conversations by the fire, when Samuel would often doze in his chair, leaving them in a private world of shared confidences and growing attraction. He learned that she had studied to be a teacher like her father, that she could name the constellations and recite Shakespeare from memory. She discovered his talent for mimicry, his fondness for apple pie, and the nightmares that sometimes woke him sweating and disoriented. They never spoke directly of what was developing between them, but Yates sensed that Samuel was aware. The older man watched their interactions with a mixture of concern and resignation, as if recognizing the inevitable but worrying about its consequences. The first major snowstorm confined them to the cabin for 3 days. They passed the time with cards, storytelling, and the mundane tasks of domestic life. On the afternoon of the third day, when the snow had stopped and the sun emerged to create a blinding white landscape, Samuel announced his intention to check the cattle. "I'll come with you," Yates offered, rising from the table where he'd been cleaning his pistol. Samuel shook his head. "No need for both of us to get cold. Besides, I could use some fresh air, even if it is below freezing." After Samuel had bundled up and departed, Lily and Yates found themselves truly alone for the first time. She stood at the window, watching her father's figure grow smaller against the expanse of snow. "He's giving us time together," she said, surprising Yates with her directness. "He's been doing that more often lately." Yates set aside the pistol parts. "And how do you feel about that?" Lily turned from the window, her green eyes steady on his. "I think he sees what's happening between us, what's been happening since you saved me from that rattlesnake." The mention of their first meeting brought a smile to Yates's lips. "You were quite a sight, standing there barefoot with that snake ready to strike." "I was terrified," she admitted, "not just of the snake but of dying alone out there with so much life unlived." "Is that why you came west, to live more fully?" She considered the question, moving to sit across from him at the table. "Partly. I also came because Father needed a fresh start after Mother died. But yes, I wanted adventure, purpose, something beyond the drawing rooms of Massachusetts." "And have you found it?" Yates asked, genuinely curious. A soft smile curved her lips. "I've found many things I wasn't expecting." The implication wasn't lost on him. Yates reached across the table, covering her hand with his own. Her skin was soft despite the hard work of homesteading, her fingers slender and capable. "Lily," he began, uncertain how to express what he felt, "I didn't plan to stay here this long. I know." Her fingers turned beneath his, interlacing them. "You're a drifter, that's what you do, drift." He corrected gently. "I was a drifter." Hope flickered in her eyes. "And now?" Yates took a deep breath. "Now I'm a man who's found something worth staying for, if you'll have me." The words weren't quite a proposal, it was too soon for that, with too many uncertainties still before them. But it was a declaration of intent, a promise of possibility. Lily's smile bloomed like a wildflower after rain. "I believe we would have you, Yates Calloway, though Father will insist on a proper courtship, regardless of how much time he gives us alone." Yates laughed, relief and joy mingling in his chest. "I'd expect nothing less from Samuel Gardner." They sat together, hands joined, as the winter light cast long shadows across the cabin floor. Outside, the world was frozen and still, but inside, something new and vital had taken root, a future neither had dared to imagine months before. When Samuel returned an hour later, cheeks ruddy from cold, he found them still at the table, engaged in earnest conversation. He took in their linked hands and exchanged smiles with a knowing look. "I take it you two have come to an understanding," he said, hanging his coat by the door. Yates stood facing the older man squarely. "Sir, with your permission, I'd like to court your daughter properly." Samuel's expression was solemn, but his eyes held warmth. "And your intentions, Honorable," Yates assured him. "I care deeply for Lily. Given time and your blessing, I hope to make her my wife." Samuel nodded slowly. "You're a good man, Yates. You've proven that these past months—" He glanced at Lily, who had risen to stand beside Yates. "And my daughter has always had excellent judgment in matters of character. Then you approve?" Lily asked, a note of tension in her voice. "I do," Samuel confirmed, "though I have conditions." "Name them," Yates said immediately. "First, this courtship proceeds at a proper pace. Second, you'll continue working the land as we agreed. And third—" He paused, his expression growing more serious. "You must be prepared for Harrington's reaction when he learns of your commitment to this family. He may see it as further defiance." Yates hadn't considered this angle, but Samuel was right. By aligning himself permanently with the Gardners, he was taking a clear side in their dispute with the cattle baron. "I understand the risk," he said firmly, "and I accept it." Samuel clasped his shoulder. "Then welcome to the family, son, or at least the beginning of that journey." The days that followed were filled with a new sense of purpose and joy. The courtship proceeded according to Samuel's conditions, with proper decorum maintained despite the close quarters of the cabin. Yates and Lily took walks in the snow-covered meadows, spent evenings reading aloud to each other, and gradually shared the deeper parts of their histories and hopes. He told her about Caroline, about the dreams they'd had and the devastating loss of her death. Lily spoke of her mother's long illness, of the weight of responsibility she'd shouldered at 18 when Gardner could no longer manage the household. "We're both familiar with grief," she observed one evening as they watched the sunset paint the snow-covered mountains gold and pink. "Perhaps that's why we recognize something in each other." Yates nodded, his arm around her shoulders as they stood on the porch. "There's a depth to you, Lily Gardner, a quiet strength that reminds me why life is worth the living, even after loss." She leaned into him, her head resting against his shoulder. "I feel the same about you. You've brought something back to this homestead that was missing, not just your labor, but a sense of possibility." He pressed a kiss to her copper hair, marveling at how this woman had broken through defenses built over years of solitary wandering. With Lily, he could imagine a future children running in these meadows, gray hairs and rocking chairs, a life built on something more substantial than the shifting sands of the trail. Winter settled in earnest around the homestead, bringing blizzards that howled around the cabin corners and days of crystalline beauty, when the sun transformed the landscape into a dazzling wonderland. Isolated by weather and distance, the three occupants of the cabin developed routines that allowed for both togetherness and privacy. Yates constructed a small workshop in one corner of the stable, where he crafted furniture for the cabin and continued his whittling. Samuel devoted hours to his journals and correspondence with other educators back east. Lily experimented with recipes, mended clothing, and worked on a quilt she'd begun as a wedding gift for herself and Yates, though she kept this purpose secret, even as he admired her handiwork. It was during this peaceful interlude, when the land lay dormant under its blanket of snow, that Victor Harrington finally made his move. Not with violence or sabotage, but with the law. The sheriff arrived one bitterly cold January afternoon, his horse struggling through drifts as he approached the cabin. Samuel met him at the door while Yates watched from the stable, instantly alert to potential trouble. "Afternoon, Gardner," Sheriff Dobson said, his tone professionally neutral despite the long-standing tension between them. "Got some papers for you." Samuel accepted the document, scanning its contents with growing disbelief. "This is preposterous," he said finally. "Harrington claims we're diverting water illegally. The creek runs through our property. He's filed a formal complaint," Dobson replied, clearly uncomfortable. "Says your dam is preventing water from reaching his lower pastures. There's to be a hearing in town next week." "In the middle of winter," Samuel protested. "The creek's frozen solid," Dobson shrugged. "Judge Parker's orders. You'll need to be there or risk a default judgment against you." After the sheriff departed, Samuel brought the papers inside where Yates and Lily could review them. The legal language was convoluted, but the intent was clear. Harrington was using the territorial court to accomplish what intimidation had failed to do. "This is absurd," Lily fumed, pacing the cabin floor. "We built that small dam for our irrigation system last spring, and it hasn't affected downstream flow at all. Father measured it specifically to avoid this very accusation." "Harrington doesn't need facts," Yates pointed out grimly. "He needs a sympathetic judge and enough legal complications to wear you down." Samuel sank into his chair, suddenly looking older than his 53 years. "We can't afford a lawyer," he said, "and I'm no match for Harrington's legal team in a courtroom." "But you have right on your side," Lily insisted, kneeling beside his chair. "And documentation of the water levels. Surely that counts for something." "It should," Samuel agreed wearily. "But right doesn't always prevail in frontier justice, Lily girl." Yates had been studying the complaint more carefully. "There's something else at play here," he said slowly. "These measurements Harrington cites there from last autumn before the freeze. He's been planning this for months." "Why wait until now?" Lily wondered. "Because we're snowbound and vulnerable," Samuel replied. "The journey to town will be dangerous in these conditions. He's counting on us not appearing for the hearing." Yates's jaw tightened with anger. It was a clever strategy force, a legal confrontation when travel was most difficult. Then claim victory by default when the Gardners couldn't attend. If the judge ruled in Harrington's favor, he could demand the dam be dismantled come spring, effectively crippling the homestead's ability to irrigate crops. "I'll go," Yates decided. "I can make better time alone, and I know these mountains in winter." "It has to be me," Samuel countered. "I'm the legal owner of the property." "Then we'll both go," Yates insisted. "Two men have a better chance against the conditions and against whatever Harrington might have planned on the trail." The concern in Lily's eyes was evident, but she nodded in agreement. "You'll need provisions for at least 4 days. The hearing is on Tuesday, and it's a full day's ride in good conditions." They spent the evening packing food, checking weapons, planning their route. Lily was quieter than usual as she helped, her movements efficient but her eyes troubled. Later, when Samuel had retired, she found Yates in the stable preparing the horses for the journey. "I don't like this," she said without preamble. "It feels like a trap." Yates paused in adjusting a saddle blanket. "It probably is," he admitted, "but we don't have a choice." Lily moved closer, her breath visible in the cold air of the stable. "Promise me you'll be careful, both of you." He drew her into his arms, holding her against the wool of his coat. "I'll bring your father home safely," he promised. "And then we'll end this conflict with Harrington once and for all." She looked up at him, her green eyes serious in the lantern light. "How? He won't stop until he has what he wants. Then we'll have to convince him that what he wants isn't worth the cost." Yates's voice held a determination that brooked no argument. "One way or another, this ends after the hearing." Lily studied his face, reading the resolve there. "Just come back to me," she whispered. "Both of you." His answer was a kiss, gentle at first, then deepening as she responded with equal fervor. It was a promise more binding than words, a pledge to return not just to the homestead, but to the future they were building together. Dawn brought clear skies but bitter cold as Yates and Samuel set out for El Dorado. They rode single file through the deep snow, Yates taking the lead to break trail while Samuel followed with the pack horse. The journey would normally take 8 hours, but in these conditions, they expected to make camp before reaching town. They traveled in relative silence, conserving energy and staying alert for signs of trouble. By midday, they had covered perhaps a third of the distance, following the ridge line that offered the most direct route to El Dorado. It was as they descended toward a narrow pass that Yates noticed the tracks 2 sets of horseshoes, recently made despite the fresh snowfall of the previous night. He raised a hand, signaling Samuel to halt. "We're being followed," he said quietly when the older man drew alongside. "Or someone's waiting ahead." Samuel nodded grimly, one hand moving to the rifle slung across his back. "Harrington's men, likely." Yates studied the surrounding terrain, considering their options. The pass ahead was the most direct route, but also a perfect location for an ambush. The alternative was a longer trail that wound around the base of the mountain, safer, perhaps, but adding hours to their journey. "We can't risk being late to that hearing," Samuel pointed out, reading Yates's thoughts. "And we can't ride knowingly into a trap," Yates countered. "There's a third option. We leave the horses here, concealed, and proceed on foot through those trees." He pointed to a dense stand of pines that paralleled the pass. "We can observe the situation before committing." Samuel agreed, and they secured the horses in a sheltered hollow before continuing on foot. The snow was deep among the trees, making progress slow and exhausting, but they eventually reached a vantage point overlooking the pass. Yates's suspicions were confirmed. 2 riders waited at the narrowest point, partially concealed behind an outcropping of rock. Even from a distance, the rifles across their laps were clearly visible. "Welcoming committee," Samuel muttered, his breath frosting in the air. "Not very subtle," Yates observed. "They must be desperate to stop us reaching town." They retreated to discuss their options. Direct confrontation was risky while Yates was confident in his abilities. Gunplay in these conditions could leave one or both of them wounded miles from help. Yet circumventing the ambush would cost precious hours they couldn't afford. "I'll create a diversion," Yates decided finally. "Draw them away from the pass while you continue to town." Samuel shook his head emphatically. "Too dangerous. We stick together." "There's no time for both of us to take the long way around," Yates insisted. "You need to be at that hearing, and I need to make sure you get there." They argued in fierce whispers until a compromise was reached. Yates would create a distraction sufficient to clear the pass. Then both would ride through together. It wasn't ideal, but it acknowledged both the urgency of their mission and the danger of separation. Using skills honed through years on the frontier, Yates circled wide around the ambush site. He gathered dry branches, created a small fire bundle wrapped in his bandana, and set it alight in a location that would draw the attention of the waiting men without immediately revealing his presence. The tactic worked better than expected. As smoke rose through the trees, both men abandoned their position to investigate, clearly concerned about a forest fire that could trap them in the pass. The moment they were clear, Yates sprinted back to Samuel and the horses. "Now," he urged, swinging into the saddle. "Ride hard and don't stop until we're through." They galloped through the pass, hooves thundering on the packed snow. Behind them, shouts of anger erupted as their presence was discovered, followed by the crack of rifle fire. But distance and poor shooting angles favored the fleeing men, and soon they were beyond effective range. "That was too close," Samuel gasped when they finally slowed their mounts to a sustainable pace. Yates nodded, checking to ensure they weren't being pursued. "They'll likely try again before we reach town. Harrington would have positioned men at several points along the route. Then we avoid the route, Samuel decided. There's an old trapper's trail that follows the river. It's longer but less predictable. The decision proved wise. Though the river trail added miles to their journey and forced them to make camp for the night in a hastily constructed lean-to, they encountered no further opposition. They reached El Dorado by mid-morning the following day, tired and cold but unharmed. The town was quiet under its blanket of snow, with only a few hardy souls moving between buildings. They stabled their horses at the livery and made their way to the small hotel, where they secured a room and the luxury of hot water for washing. "The hearing is at 2 o'clock, Samuel said, consulting the papers Sheriff Dobson had delivered. "That gives us time to eat and prepare." Yates was less concerned with preparation than security. "Harrington will know we've arrived by now. We should stay together and remain visible. Makes it harder for his men to try anything in town." They ate at the hotel dining room, deliberately choosing a table near the window where they could be seen by anyone passing. The meal was simple but hot beef stew and fresh bread that tasted like ambrosia after trail rations. As they ate, Yates studied the other patrons, noting several who seemed too interested in their presence. "Harrington has eyes everywhere," he murmured to Samuel. "Best keep your arguments close until the hearing." Samuel nodded, but his attention had fixed on a man entering the dining room tall, expensively dressed, with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to deference. "Speaking of Harrington," he said quietly. Victor Harrington paused in the doorway, surveying the room until his gaze landed on their table. A smile that never reached his eyes spread across his face as he approached. "Gardner," he greeted Samuel with exaggerated cordiality. "Didn't expect to see you in town, given the weather." "Legal matters wait for no man, Harrington," Samuel replied coolly. "Or so I'm told." Harrington's gaze shifted to Yates, assessing. "Your new hired hand, I presume. I've heard interesting things about you, Calloway." Yates met the cattle baron's stare without flinching. "Can't believe everything you hear." "Oh, I'm selective in what I believe," Harrington assured him, his tone pleasant but his meaning clear. "For instance, I don't believe a man with your background simply decides to become a farmhand without ulterior motives." The implication was troubling. Harrington had investigated Yates's past, perhaps knew about incidents best left buried. But Yates maintained his composure, refusing to be baited. "My motives are my own," he said evenly. Harrington's smile widened fractionally. "Indeed they are. Well, gentlemen, I look forward to our meeting this afternoon. Judge Parker is most interested in resolving this water dispute equitably." After he departed, Samuel leaned forward. "What did he mean about your background?" Yates sighed. This conversation had been inevitable, but he'd hoped to have it under better circumstances. "Before Wyoming, before Caroline, I rode with some rough men in Kansas territory. Did things I'm not proud of." "You were an outlaw." Samuel's voice was carefully neutral. "For a time," Yates admitted. "Until I saw what that life really meant and walked away, I've been straight ever since." Samuel studied him for a long moment. "Does Lily know?" "Not the details. I told her I'd made mistakes in my youth." The older man nodded slowly. "We all have pasts, Yates. It's what we do with the present that defines us." He pushed back from the table. "Come, we should review our documentation before the hearing." The territorial courthouse was a relatively new structure, built of local stone and timber with pretensions of grandeur that its frontier setting couldn't quite support. By 2 o'clock, the main courtroom was filled with curious townspeople, drawn by the prospect of witnessing a confrontation between two stubborn men, one wealthy and powerful, the other principled and determined. Judge Elias Parker presided from a raised desk, his black robes and stern demeanor intended to lend gravity to the proceedings. Harrington sat with two lawyers at a table to the judge's right, while Samuel and Yates occupied a table on the left. The hearing began with formalities: the reading of Harrington's complaint, acknowledgement of the parties present, and the judge's admonition that the proceedings should remain civil, despite the contentious nature of the dispute. Harrington's lead lawyer presented their case first, using maps and diagrams to argue that the Gardner Dam had reduced water flow to Harrington's southern pastures by 30%, resulting in economic hardship and threatening the viability of his cattle operation. When Samuel's turn came, he approached the matter with the methodical precision of a schoolteacher. He presented his own measurements of water flow, taken before and after the dam's construction, which showed minimal impact downstream. He explained the irrigation system's design, which allowed excess water to continue to the lower properties. Furthermore, he concluded, Mr. Harrington's claim of 30% reduction is impossible, given that our dam diverts less than 15% of the creek's total volume during peak operation and is completely inactive during winter months when the water is frozen. The logical presentation seemed to sway the judge, who asked pointed questions of both parties. But Harrington's lawyers were skilled, casting doubt on Samuel's amateur measurements and suggesting that spring runoff patterns would be permanently altered by the Gardner construction. As the arguments continued, Yates observed the courtroom dynamics with growing concern. While Judge Parker appeared to be listening impartially, certain exchanges between him and Harrington suggested a familiarity that extended beyond professional courtesy. When Harrington's lawyer presented a letter from the Territorial Water Commissioner, a document Samuel had never been shown, the judge accepted it without question. The hearing stretched into its third hour when Harrington played his final card. "Your Honor," his lawyer said smoothly, "we have one additional concern regarding the Gardner property that bears on this water dispute. It has come to our attention that Mr. Gardner has taken on a partner in his enterprise, one Yates Calloway." Samuel straightened in surprise. "That's not accurate. Mr. Calloway is an employee, not a partner." "Is that so?" The lawyer produced another document. "We have a sworn statement from witnesses who observed Mr. Calloway claiming partnership rights and making decisions about property improvements without consultation." "This is absurd," Samuel protested, "and irrelevant to the water issue at hand." "On the contrary," the lawyer continued, "if Mr. Calloway is indeed a de facto partner, his background becomes relevant to these proceedings. We have reason to believe he has operated under different names in Kansas Territory, where he was implicated in various criminal activities." A murmur ran through the courtroom as all eyes turned to Yates. He remained outwardly calm, though inwardly he cursed Harrington's thorough investigation. Judge Parker frowned. "Is this true, Mr. Calloway?" Yates rose slowly, facing the judge. "Your Honor, my past is not on trial here, nor is it relevant to whether the Gardner Dam complies with territorial water laws. But since Mr. Harrington seems intent on distracting from the actual issue, I'll address it directly." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I made mistakes in my youth. I've never denied that. But I've lived honestly for many years, and my relationship with the Gardner family is exactly as Mr. Gardner described. I'm employed as a ranch hand, nothing more." "Yet you traveled here to represent Gardner interests," Harrington interjected smoothly. "Curious behavior for a mere employee." Before Yates could respond, the courtroom door burst open. Heads turned as Lily Gardner strode down the center aisle, her travel-worn appearance testament to a difficult journey. "Your Honor," she called clearly, I have evidence relevant to these proceedings. Judge Parker blinked in surprise. Young woman, this is highly irregular. So is attempting to murder my father and Mr. Calloway on their way to this hearing, Lily replied, her voice steady despite the audible gasps from the spectators. I have 2 men in custody who will testify that Mr. Harrington paid them to ambush our representatives and prevent their appearance today. The courtroom erupted in chaos. Harrington surged to his feet, denying the accusation vehemently. The judge pounded his gavel for order. Samuel and Yates exchanged looks of equal parts amazement and concern. When relative calm was restored, Sheriff Dobson confirmed that 2 men had indeed been arrested that morning after Lily had tracked them to a saloon on the edge of town, where they were celebrating their payment despite failing in their task. They've provided sworn statements, the sheriff added, clearly uncomfortable with his role in exposing Harrington's scheme. They claim Mr. Harrington personally instructed them to ensure the Gardners didn't reach town for the hearing. Judge Parker's expression had transformed from irritation to grave concern. These are serious allegations that must be investigated fully. In light of these developments, this water dispute hearing is suspended pending a more comprehensive examination of all factors involved. It wasn't a victory precisely, but it was far from the defeat Harrington had engineered. As the courtroom dispersed, Lily joined her father and Yates, her face showing the strain of her journey but her eyes bright with triumph. How did you know? Yates asked, still processing her timely intervention. I didn't, she admitted, but I knew Harrington wouldn't leave your safe arrival to chance. After you left, I followed at a distance. When I found signs of the ambush, I tracked the men to town. Samuel embraced his daughter, his pride evident. That was incredibly dangerous, Lily girl. So was what you were facing, she countered. I couldn't sit idle while Harrington threatened everything we've worked for. Harrington himself approached as they prepared to leave, his composure restored but rage simmering beneath the surface. Impressive performance, Miss Gardner, he said coldly. But this changes nothing in the long term. That land will be mine eventually. Yates stepped between them, his voice low but carrying clearly to Harrington. You've tried intimidation, sabotage, legal manipulation, and now attempted murder. Perhaps it's time to accept that the Gardners aren't selling. Everyone has a breaking point, Calloway, Harrington replied. Even you. Is that a threat? Yates asked quietly. Harrington smiled thinly. Consider it a business observation. As he walked away, Lily slipped her hand into Yates's, squeezing gently. He's desperate now, she murmured, which makes him more dangerous. Then we'll be more vigilant, Yates replied. But first, you need to tell us exactly how you captured 2 armed men by yourself. Lily's smile held a hint of mischief. I may have mentioned to them that I was looking to hire protection against my father's enemies. They were quite eager to share their recent employment history over whiskey. Samuel laughed despite the gravity of the situation. Catherine's daughter through and through, clever and fearless to a fault. They secured rooms for the night, with plans to depart for the homestead at first light. The confrontation with Harrington wasn't over, might never be truly over as long as he coveted their water rights, but they had won a significant reprieve. That evening, while Samuel rested in preparation for the journey home, Yates and Lily walked through the quiet streets of El Dorado. Snow had begun to fall again, soft flakes that caught in Lily's hair and eyelashes. I should have told you everything about my past, Yates said as they paused beneath the overhang of the general store. Before Harrington made it an issue, Lily studied his face in the glow of the street lamp. Would it have changed who you are now? No, he replied honestly, but it might have changed how you see me. "I see a man who has traveled a long road to become who he is," she said softly. "The path matters less than the destination, Yates." He took her gloved hands in his. "Even if that path included things I'm deeply ashamed of, even then." Her gaze was steady, unflinching. "We all carry regrets. What matters is that you chose a different way forward." The understanding in her eyes humbled him. Yates had expected judgment, had prepared himself for the possibility that his past might cost him Lily's respect. Instead, he found acceptance of a depth he'd never anticipated. "I love you," he said simply, the words emerging without conscious thought. "I think I have since I saw you standing barefoot by that rattlesnake, too stubborn to run even in the face of danger." Lily's smile illuminated her entire face. "And I love you, Yates Calloway, not despite who you were, but because of who you've become." In the quiet street, with snow falling around them like a benediction, they sealed this declaration with a kiss that promised a future one built on truth, forgiveness, and the courage to stand firm against whatever storms might come. The journey back to the homestead was arduous but uneventful. Harrington's men had apparently withdrawn, at least temporarily, in the wake of the failed ambush and subsequent arrests. The three travelers maintained vigilance nonetheless, taking turns on watch during their overnight camp and staying close together on the trail. They arrived home to find the homestead undisturbed, a relief after so many incidents of sabotage. The animals greeted them with hungry impatience, and the cabin, though cold, welcomed them back with the familiar comfort of home. "What now?" Lily asked as they settled around the fire that evening, exhaustion evident in their faces but determination undiminished. Samuel stretched his tired legs toward the hearth. "We continue as before. The hearing has been postponed, not dismissed. We'll need to prepare our case more thoroughly for when it resumes." "And Harrington," Yates prompted, "will likely be facing his own legal troubles if those men testify against him," Samuel replied. "Attempted murder carries serious consequences, even for a man of his influence." Yates wasn't convinced it would be so straightforward. Men like Harrington rarely faced true justice. They had too much money, too many connections, too much power over local affairs. The testimonies of two hired guns against a respected cattle baron might not stand up to scrutiny, especially if Harrington's lawyers got involved. But he kept these concerns to himself, unwilling to dampen the cautious optimism that had settled over the Gardner household. There would be time enough for vigilance tomorrow. February brought heavier snowfall and the isolation that came with it. The world beyond the homestead seemed distant and unreal as they focused on daily survival and planning for spring. Yates used the enforced confinement to craft more furniture for the cabin, a proper writing desk for Samuel, a rocking chair that Lily immediately claimed as her own, shelves for the growing collection of books and necessities. Their courtship continued within the constraints of propriety and their limited circumstances. In the evenings, Samuel would often retire early, leaving them time alone by the fire. They talked of the future, of expanding the homestead, of children they might have, of the life they would build together when the shadow of Harrington no longer loomed over them. "We should set a date," Lily said one night as they sat together on the bearskin rug before the hearth. "For the wedding." Yates, who had been contemplating this very question, nodded. "Spring, perhaps. After the last snow, but before planting begins in earnest. April," she decided. "When the wildflowers return to the meadow." He smiled, imagining her with a crown of columbine and Indian paintbrush. "April it is. Though your father may insist on a proper church ceremony in town." "I'd marry you in a blizzard if necessary," Lily replied, nestling closer against his side. "But yes, Father will want the blessing of a proper minister. And I admit, I've dreamed of a wedding dress since I was a girl." Yates kissed the top of her head, marveling at how completely this woman had changed his life in just a few months. From solitary drifter to future husband and homesteader, it was a transformation he could never have predicted when he'd first spotted a barefoot woman facing down a rattlesnake. "You'll have your wedding dress," he promised, "and whatever else will make the day perfect." As winter slowly relinquished its grip on the land, signs of Harrington's continued interest in the Gardner property resumed. Nothing as overt as the previous attacks, no fence cutting or livestock harassment, but subtle intrusions that kept them on edge. Tracks around the property perimeter. A stranger watching the homestead from the ridge line. Rumors in town about the Gardners' financial situation that could only have originated with someone trying to undermine their standing. The postponed hearing was rescheduled for late March. This time, they would all travel together to El Dorado, leaving the homestead secured as best they could. Yates was under no illusions Harrington was unlikely to have abandoned his quest for their land, especially the water rights that were becoming increasingly valuable as more settlers arrived in the territory. But as the snow receded and the first green shoots appeared in the meadows, a more immediate concern occupied the Gardner household. A letter arrived from Judge Parker, delivered by a rider from town, informing them that new evidence had been presented regarding ownership of the Jensen property. "What new evidence?" Samuel demanded, reading the letter for the third time. "I have the deed right here, signed and notarized when we purchased the land from Jensen's estate." "It's another delaying tactic," Yates suggested. "Harrington can't win on the water dispute alone, so he's attacking the foundation of your claim." Lily, who had been unusually quiet, spoke up from her place by the window. "There's something we should consider," she said carefully. "What if there is a legitimate issue with the deed?" Samuel's expression hardened. "There isn't. I had a lawyer in Denver review everything before we made the purchase." "I'm not questioning your thoroughness, Father," Lily assured him, "but remember what Mr. Jensen told you about the original claim. How the land had been part of a larger Spanish grant before being divided." "That's ancient history," Samuel dismissed. "The territorial government recognized Jensen's ownership for 15 years before we bought it." Yates, however, was intrigued by Lily's line of thinking. "Old Spanish land grants have caused legal complications elsewhere," he pointed out, "especially when water rights are involved." The discussion continued as they prepared for bed, with no resolution beyond agreement that they needed more information before the hearing. The following morning, Yates volunteered to ride into town and speak with the county clerk who maintained property records. "Be careful," Lily urged as he saddled his horse. "Harrington will have people watching for any reaction to that letter." "I'll be discreet," he promised. And back before dark. The ride to El Dorado was uneventful, though Yates remained alert for signs of surveillance or ambush. The town itself was showing signs of spring activity, wagons being repaired, gardens being prepared, merchandise being unpacked after the winter isolation. At the county clerk's office, Yates encountered the first obstacle. The clerk, a thin man with ink-stained fingers, seemed nervous when asked about the Jensen property records. "Those files aren't currently available for public review," he explained, avoiding Yates's direct gaze. "Judge's orders." "Whose orders?" Yates pressed. "Judge Parker's," the clerk nodded uncomfortably. "The documents are part of an ongoing legal investigation." This was concerning. If Harrington had convinced Parker to sequester the records, it suggested a coordinated effort to undermine the Gardner's position before the hearing. Yates shifted tactics. "I understand. Perhaps you could tell me, hypothetically speaking, what might constitute new evidence regarding a property that's been settled for 15 years. The clerk hesitated, then glanced toward the door to ensure they were alone. Hypothetically, he said quietly, such evidence might include documentation of prior claims that weren't properly extinguished when the territory was established, or perhaps evidence that a sale was conducted under false pretenses. False pretenses, if a seller misrepresented what they owned. The clerk straightened some papers nervously. But that's purely hypothetical, Mr. Calloway. I couldn't comment on any specific case. Yates thanked him and left, his concern deepening. If Harrington was fabricating evidence of a prior claim, or suggesting that Jensen had misrepresented the property boundaries, it could tie up the Gardners in legal proceedings for years, exactly the kind of pressure that might force them to sell. His next stop was the office of the El Dorado Sentinel, the town's modest newspaper. The editor, Frank Winters, was a forthright man known for his independence from Harrington's influence, which had cost him advertisers but earned him respect. "Calloway," Winters greeted him, looking up from a printing plate he was adjusting. "Heard you were working for Samuel Gardner these days, and courting his daughter if the gossips are accurate." "News travels fast," Yates observed, taking the seat Winters offered. "It's a small town with big ears." The editor wiped ink from his hands. "What brings you to my humble establishment?" Yates explained the situation briefly: the water dispute, the postponed hearing, and now the mysterious new evidence regarding the property deed. Winters listened thoughtfully, occasionally making notes on a scrap of paper. "Harrington's getting desperate," he concluded when Yates finished. "The water rights were always his primary target, but attacking the deed itself is a scorched earth tactic." "Do you know what evidence he might have found?" "Not specifically," Winters admitted. "But there's been talk around town about an old Spanish family claiming parts of what became Jensen land. Supposedly, Harrington's lawyers tracked down descendants living in Santa Fe." This aligned with what Lily had mentioned about the original Spanish grant. Could such a claim have merit after all this time? Winters shrugged. "Legally, probably not. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo supposedly protected Spanish and Mexican land grants, but in practice, American courts have whittled away those protections. But merit isn't the point, delay is. Harrington just needs to create enough legal confusion that the Gardners run out of resources to fight." "Is there anyone in town who might know more about the original grant? Someone who was here before Jensen?" The editor considered this. "Old Tom Beckett might. He was trapping in these mountains before El Dorado was more than a couple of tents, lives in a cabin north of town now." Armed with directions to Beckett's place, Yates thanked Winters and prepared to leave. The editor stopped him at the door. "Calloway," he said seriously, "be careful with this. Harrington doesn't like losing, and he particularly doesn't like losing to people he considers beneath him. If he can't get that land legally, he might try other means." "He already has," Yates replied grimly. "Hasn't worked out well for him so far." The ride to Tom Beckett's cabin took Yates several miles out of his way, but he judged the potential information worth the delay. The old trapper's dwelling was nestled in a small clearing, smoke rising from a stone chimney. A pack of dogs announced Yates's arrival with enthusiastic barking. Beckett himself emerged at the commotion, a wiry man with a white beard reaching his chest and eyes that remained sharp despite his advanced years. He quieted the dogs with a word and squinted at his visitor. "Don't often get callers this time of year," he observed. "What brings you to my door, stranger?" Yates introduced himself and explained his errand, mentioning Winter's recommendation. Beckett listened impassively, then gestured toward the cabin. "Might as well come in," he said. "Got coffee on the stove." The interior of the cabin was cluttered but surprisingly clean, with animal pelts decorating the walls and handcrafted furniture arranged around a central hearth. Beckett poured coffee into tin mugs and settled into a chair that creaked under his weight. "So you're asking about the old Spanish grant," he said without preamble. "The Valverde claim." Yates leaned forward. "You know of it?" "Course I do. Was here when Don Miguel Valverde's grandson came through in '53 trying to reassert the family claim. Territorial court wouldn't hear him out, said the documentation was insufficient and the land had been legally homesteaded by then. Jensen had already settled by that time. Beckett nodded. Jensen came in '49 during the first gold rush, found no gold but plenty of good grazing land. Built that place up from nothing. And the Valverde claim was dismissed entirely. The old man's eyes narrowed shrewdly. Officially, yes, but there was a settlement of sorts. Jensen gave the Valverde heir some cash and a small parcel at the southern edge of the property where the hot springs are. Agreement was signed and filed with the Territorial Land Office in Denver. This was crucial information. If Jensen had settled with the Valverde family legally, any claim Harrington was resurrecting would have to acknowledge that settlement. Would records of that agreement still exist? Yates asked. Should, Beckett replied. Though convenient fires have been known to destroy inconvenient documents in these parts. Yates finished his coffee and rose to leave, thanking Beckett for his time and information. The old trapper walked him to the door, then paused. One more thing you should know, he said quietly. The Valverde heir who came in '53, his name was Eduardo, had a sister named Constanza who married into the Harrington family back in Texas. The implications were clear. Harrington's connection to the Valverde claim wasn't coincidental, it was familial. He might be using distant relations to reassert a claim that had already been legally settled. As Yates rode back toward the Gardner homestead, he processed this new information. The legal situation was more complex than they had realized, but also potentially more favorable. If they could locate records of Jensen's settlement with the Valverde heir, it would undermine whatever case Harrington was constructing. The sun was setting as he approached the homestead, casting long shadows across the meadow. From a distance, everything appeared normal: smoke rising from the chimney, cattle in their pen, the blue shutters bright against the weathered logs of the cabin. It was only as he drew closer that Yates noticed the front door standing open, unusual given the evening chill. His instincts immediately alert, he slowed his approach and scanned the surrounding area for signs of trouble. The stillness that greeted him was unnatural. No movement at the windows. No sound of chopping or animals. Just the faint creak of the door swinging gently in the breeze. Yates dismounted at a distance, drew his revolver and approached on foot. The silence pressed against his ears as he reached the porch, every sense straining for information. "Samuel," he called. "Lily?" No response. He entered cautiously, weapon ready. The main room showed signs of disturbance: a chair overturned, a plate broken on the floor. Samuel's rifle, normally kept above the door, was missing. "Lily," he called again, more urgently. A soft sound from the back of the cabin drew his attention. He moved quickly to Samuel's bedroom, finding the older man sprawled on the floor, a bloody gash across his forehead. "Samuel!" Yates holstered his weapon and knelt beside him, checking for a pulse. It was there, steady beneath his fingers. "What happened?" "Where's Lily?" Samuel's eyes fluttered open, confusion giving way to panic as awareness returned. "Harrington's men," he gasped, struggling to sit up. "Took her, said I had to sign over the deed if I wanted to see her alive." Cold fury swept through Yates as he helped Samuel to a chair. "How many men? How long ago?" "3 of them. An hour, maybe less." Samuel pressed a handkerchief to his bleeding head. They went north toward Harrington's ranch. Yates, they were serious. The leader, a man called Mercer, said Harrington was tired of waiting for legal solutions. Yates was already moving, gathering ammunition and supplies. "I'll bring her back," he promised, his voice deadly calm. "You ride to town, find Sheriff Dobson. Tell him what's happened." "Dobson won't cross Harrington," Samuel objected weakly. "Then find Winters at the newspaper. He'll spread the word, force Dobson's hand." Yates checked his pistol, then retrieved his rifle from the loft. "Can you ride?" Samuel nodded grimly, determination overcoming his injury. "For my daughter, I can ride through hell itself. Get to town and raise the alarm. I'm going after them directly." They parted in the yard, Samuel heading toward El Dorado while Yates turned north toward Harrington land. The spring twilight was fading rapidly, but a nearly full moon provided enough light to follow the trail left by 3 horses carrying riders in a hurry. As he rode, Yates forced down the fear and rage that threatened to overwhelm his judgment. Lily needed him thinking clearly, planning strategically. Harrington's ranch was heavily guarded, with bunkhouses full of loyal men. A frontal assault would be suicide. But Yates had skills from his outlaw days that might serve him now, skills in stealth, in approaching unseen, in creating diversion and confusion. Skills he'd thought never to use again, but would employ without hesitation to save Lily. The tracks led him across the ridge line and down into a valley where Harrington's land began. The main ranch house was still miles ahead, but Yates knew the territory included several line cabins where workers stayed during roundups and branding. The trail veered toward one such cabin, a strategic choice if Harrington wanted to keep Lily separate from his main operation. Plausible deniability if things went wrong. Yates slowed his approach as he spotted a faint light through the trees. The line cabin sat in a small clearing. A single horse still saddled outside, suggesting at least one guard remained. The other tracks continued onward, probably carrying news to Harrington that his plan had succeeded. Dismounting well back from the clearing, Yates secured his horse and moved forward on foot. Years of hunting had taught him how to step silently, how to use terrain and shadow to mask his approach. He circled the cabin, assessing its layout and potential weaknesses. A single window glowed with lamplight. Through it, he could see a man seated at a rough table, cleaning a revolver. Of Lily, there was no sign from this angle, but a second window on the far side was dark. Yates considered his options. He could wait for Samuel to return with help, but that might take hours during which Lily remained in danger. He could attempt to negotiate, but men who would kidnap a woman were unlikely to respond to reason. Or he could do what he did best, act decisively when others were at risk. His decision made, Yates retreated to his horse and retrieved a small flask of whiskey from his saddlebag. Dousing a bundle of dry grass, he set it alight at the edge of the clearing, upwind of the cabin. The spring night was dry and the flames caught quickly, creating a fast-spreading distraction. As smoke drifted toward the cabin, the guard predictably emerged, weapon drawn. "What the hell?" he muttered, moving toward the growing fire. Yates circled behind him, silent as a mountain cat. When the guard bent to examine the fire's origin, Yates struck a quick, hard blow to the base of the skull with his pistol butt. The man crumpled without a sound. Securing the unconscious guard with his own belt, Yates approached the cabin cautiously. Through the window, he could now see into the second room, and there was Lily, hands bound to a chair, a determined expression on her face despite the circumstances. Relief flooded him, followed immediately by renewed focus. She was alive and apparently unharmed, but still in danger until they were safely away. He tried the cabin door, Finding it unlocked another sign of the captor's overconfidence. The hinges creaked slightly as he eased it open, stepping into the main room with his pistol ready. Lily's eyes widened as she saw him. Before she could speak, he pressed a finger to his lips, then moved quickly to untie her bonds. "Are you hurt?" he whispered, hands gentle as he freed her wrists. She shook her head. "Just angry," she whispered back. "There's only one guard." The others went to report to Harrington. "The guard's been neutralized," Yates assured her. "Can you walk?" "I can do better than walk," she replied with fierce determination. "I can help you make them regret ever touching me." Despite the gravity of the situation, Yates felt a surge of admiration for her spirit. "First, we get you to safety. Then we deal with Harrington permanently." They moved silently to the door, but as Yates reached to open it, the sound of approaching horses shattered their hope of clean escape. The riders who had taken the news to Harrington were returning, and judging by the multiple hoofbeats, they'd brought reinforcements. "Back door," Lily whispered urgently, pulling him toward the rear of the cabin. They slipped out just as riders entered the clearing, voices raised in alarm at the sight of the small fire and unconscious guard. Keeping low, they circled wide through the trees until they reached Yates's horse. "Ride double?" Lily asked as he helped her mount. Yates shook his head, unhooking a second set of reins from his saddle. "I brought a lead rope for the guard's horse. Wait here." Before she could object, he disappeared back toward the cabin. Moments of tense silence followed, punctuated by angry shouts from the clearing as the returned men discovered their prisoner missing. Just as Lily was considering following him, Yates reappeared, leading the guard's horse at a trot. "Time to leave," he said grimly, swinging into his saddle. "They'll be searching as soon as they organize." They rode hard through the moonlit forest, taking a route that would confuse pursuers, doubling back occasionally, crossing streams to break their trail, keeping to rocky ground where possible. Lily matched Yates's pace without complaint, her face set with determination. Only when they had put several miles between themselves and the cabin did Yates slow their pace to rest the horses. "We need to get you back to the homestead," he said, studying her in the moonlight. "Your father's likely half mad with worry by now." Lily shook her head firmly. "We can't go back, not yet. Harrington will send men there first thing. We need to get to town where there are witnesses." She was right, and Yates knew it. The homestead was isolated and vulnerable. If Harrington was desperate enough to resort to kidnapping, he might well escalate to more violent measures. "Town it is," he agreed. "Your father should be there by now, raising the alarm." They altered course toward El Dorado, maintaining a steady pace that would get them there before midnight. As they rode, Lily described what had happened, how 3 men had arrived claiming to have a message from Yates, then forced their way in when Samuel grew suspicious. They weren't trying to hide Harrington's involvement, she explained. The leader, Mercer, said quite openly that his boss was tired of waiting for the courts to settle things, that sometimes men needed to take direct action to protect their interests. "Harrington's getting reckless," Yates observed. "That kind of open threat won't play well in territorial court." "If it ever gets to court," Lily replied soberly. Mercer seemed confident that once father signed over the deed, there would be no further legal issues. He implied that we would be encouraged to leave the territory entirely. The implications were clear. Harrington had abandoned any pretense of legal maneuvering and moved to outright intimidation. It was a dangerous escalation, but also a potentially fatal mistake. Even the wealthiest men couldn't operate entirely outside the law, especially when their actions became public knowledge. El Dorado was unusually active for the late hour when they arrived. Lanterns glowed in several buildings, and knots of men gathered on the main street, their faces grave in the lamplight. As Yates and Lily rode toward the sheriff's office, a shout went up. "It's them! They're here!" Samuel burst from the sheriff's office, his injured head now bandaged, and ran to meet them. The reunion was emotional, Lily sliding from her horse into her father's embrace, while onlookers watched with expressions ranging from relief to curiosity. Sheriff Dobson emerged more sedately, his weathered face unreadable as he approached. "Miss Gardner," he acknowledged with a nod, "I'm glad to see you safe. No thanks to your indifference to Harrington's activities," Yates couldn't help saying. The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "Careful with accusations, Calloway. I've got men riding to Harrington's ranch right now to investigate these claims." "And what will they find?" Yates challenged. "You think Harrington won't have a story prepared, that he won't claim this was all a misunderstanding?" "That's enough," Samuel interjected firmly. "What matters is that Lily is safe. Now we need to ensure justice is served." Editor Winters pushed through the gathering crowd. "And justice needs witnesses," he announced, notebook in hand. "Miss Gardner, would you be willing to give a statement about what happened? The people should know what Harrington is capable of." Before Lily could respond, a new commotion drew their attention to the end of the street. A group of riders approached, the leader's identity clear even in the dim light: Victor Harrington himself, flanked by several armed men. The crowd parted silently as Harrington dismounted before the sheriff's office. He was immaculately dressed despite the hour, his confident bearing unchanged by the hostile stares directed his way. "Sheriff," he greeted Dobson smoothly, "I understand there's been some trouble involving my employees. I've come to clear up any misunderstandings." "Misunderstandings?" Samuel stepped forward, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Your men assaulted me and kidnapped my daughter. There's no misunderstanding possible." Harrington's expression remained pleasant, though his eyes were cold. "My men report that Miss Gardner accompanied them voluntarily to discuss the property dispute. If there was any confusion about the nature of the invitation, I deeply regret it." "Liar," Lily said clearly, stepping to her father's side. "They tied me to a chair and told my father they'd kill me if he didn't sign over the deed." A murmur ran through the crowd at this direct accusation. Harrington's smile tightened fractionally. "A serious charge, Miss Gardner. One that would be difficult to prove, given the lack of witnesses beyond my men who naturally tell a different story." Yates moved forward, positioning himself protectively near Lily. "There's the guard I left unconscious at your line cabin. I doubt he'll be eager to perjure himself if it means hanging for kidnapping." For the first time, uncertainty flickered in Harrington's expression. He hadn't expected the guard to be captured, hadn't prepared for that contingency in his narrative. Sheriff Dobson, watching this exchange with growing discomfort, finally spoke up. "Mr. Harrington, these are serious allegations. I'll need statements from everyone involved." "Of course, Sheriff," Harrington agreed smoothly, recovering his composure. "My men and I are at your disposal. Though I would point out that Mr. Calloway's involvement complicates matters, given his colorful history." The reference to Yates's past was deliberate, a reminder that his testimony might be considered unreliable by a judge familiar with his outlaw background. But before Harrington could press this advantage, another voice joined the confrontation. "I can corroborate part of their story," announced Frank Winters, stepping forward with his notebook. "I was with Sheriff Dobson when Gardner arrived in town, bleeding and desperate. His account of the attack was given before he knew his daughter had been rescued. There was no opportunity to fabricate details." Others in the crowd began to speak up as well, townspeople who had seen Harrington's men riding hard toward the Gardner property that afternoon. a storekeeper who had overheard Mercer boasting about a special job for the boss, a stable hand who had observed the men returning with a struggling female rider. As the testimonies accumulated, Harrington's confident demeanor began to crack. He had expected to control the narrative, to dismiss the Gardner's claims as exaggeration or misunderstanding. Instead, he found himself facing a community that had apparently grown tired of his manipulation and intimidation. "Enough of this public spectacle," he snapped finally. "Sheriff, if you have questions for me, you can ask them privately in your office." "Actually," Dobson replied, surprising everyone with his suddenly firm tone, "I think I'll need you and your men to remain in town while we sort this out. Consider yourselves restricted to El Dorado until further notice." Harrington's face darkened with anger. "You're exceeding your authority, Dobson. I'll have your badge for this." "Maybe so," the sheriff acknowledged, "but kidnapping and extortion are territorial matters. The federal marshal in Denver will be very interested in these allegations, and he doesn't answer to you." A tense silence followed this declaration. Harrington's gaze swept the hostile faces surrounding him, lingering on Yates and Lily with particular venom. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "Not by a long shot." "Actually, I think it is," Lily replied, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. "You've shown your true nature to everyone here tonight. Whatever happens next, you've lost something more valuable than land or water rights. You've lost respect." The truth of her words was evident in the expressions of the townspeople. Even those who had previously deferred to Harrington's wealth and influence were now viewing him with wary suspicion. With a final glare, Harrington turned and stalked toward the hotel, his men following after, surrendering their weapons to Dobson's deputies. The crowd slowly dispersed, though many paused to offer support to the Gardners before departing. "You should all get some rest," Sheriff Dobson suggested when only a few onlookers remained. "The hotel has rooms available, and I'll have deputies watching to ensure there's no further trouble tonight." Samuel nodded gratefully. "Thank you, Sheriff. Your support is unexpected but appreciated." Dobson looked uncomfortable at the implied criticism of his previous inaction. "I've been too accommodating of Harrington's influence," he admitted gruffly. "That changes now." As they walked toward the hotel, Lily leaned against Yates, the events of the day finally catching up with her. He slipped an arm around her waist, supporting her tired steps. "You were magnificent tonight," he murmured. "Facing down Harrington like that in front of the whole town." She smiled wearily. "I was terrified, but also angry enough to overcome the fear." "That's courage," he told her. "Not fearlessness, but acting despite fear." Samuel, walking ahead to arrange their rooms, glanced back with a knowing expression. "You two have had quite an eventful courtship," he observed dryly. "Perhaps it's time to consider advancing the timeline." Lily looked up at Yates questioningly. He understood the implication immediately. Samuel was suggesting they marry sooner rather than later, perhaps as a statement of permanent commitment to the land and community that had rallied to their defense. "What do you think?" he asked Lily. "Still want those April wildflowers, or would you consider becoming Mrs. Calloway a bit sooner?" Her smile was answer enough, even before she spoke. "I think I've waited long enough for happiness," she said softly. "Besides, I suspect spring is already arriving in El Dorado earlier than expected." The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity. True to his word, Sheriff Dobson contacted the federal marshal in Denver, who arrived within days to investigate the kidnapping allegations. Mercer and another of Harrington's men, faced with serious charges and limited loyalty to their employer, provided testimony that corroborated Lily's account. Harrington himself, was arrested on charges of conspiracy and attempted extortion. His lawyers arranged bail, but the damage to his reputation and influence was substantial. Many of his business associates distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with such blatant criminality. The water dispute hearing was indefinitely postponed, as more pressing legal matters took precedence. The mysterious new evidence regarding the property deed never materialized, likely because, as Yates had discovered through old Tom Beckett, any legitimate claim had been settled years before. Through it all, preparations for the wedding continued. The Gardner homestead, briefly abandoned during the crisis, became the center of renewed activity. The community that had stood with them against Harrington now rallied to help prepare for the celebration, women arriving with food and decorations, men assisting with repairs and improvements to the property. Lily found a wedding dress in a trunk of her mother's belongings, a simple gown of ivory silk that, with minor alterations, fit as if made for her. Samuel, watching her try it on for the first time, had tears in his eyes. "Catherine would be so proud," he told his daughter, "of the woman you've become and the life you're building." The ceremony took place on the first Sunday in April, just as the earliest wildflowers were beginning to dot the meadow around the homestead. Reverend Collins from the El Dorado Church officiated, his sonorous voice carrying across the gathering of friends and neighbors assembled in the spring sunshine. Yates, standing before the improvised altar with Samuel at his side, felt a profound sense of completion as Lily approached. She wore Catherine's dress and a crown of fresh columbine in her copper hair, her green eyes bright with joy as they met his. The vows were traditional, but spoken with deep personal meaning, promises of love, fidelity, and partnership that both intended to honor for a lifetime. When Reverend Collins pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that rose from the assembled guests seemed to echo across the valley, a testament to the community's investment in their happiness. The celebration continued throughout the day and into evening, with music and dancing on the packed earth of the yard. Samuel, watching his daughter and new son-in-law move through the steps of a waltz, found himself approached by Frank Winters. "Quite a turnaround from where things stood a few months ago," the editor observed. "Your homestead saved, Harrington facing trial, and a wedding to celebrate." Samuel nodded, his expression reflective. "Life has a way of surprising us. When Catherine died, I thought our family's story was ending. Instead, it was just changing course." As darkness fell, lanterns were lit around the yard, creating pools of golden light where couples continued to dance. Yates and Lily eventually slipped away from the festivities to stand on the porch of the cabin that would now be their home, Samuel having announced his intention to build a smaller dwelling for himself nearby. "Happy, Mrs. Calloway?" Yates asked, his arms around her waist as they looked out at the land that had brought them together. Lily leaned back against him, her head resting on his shoulder. "Completely. Though I still can't believe how it all began with a rattlesnake and a barefoot woman too stubborn to run." "I knew you were special from that first moment," he admitted, standing there so brave and determined, even in the face of danger. "And I knew you were different from any man I'd met," she replied, turning in his arms to face him. "The way you handled that snake, calm and confident, but also kind. You could have mocked my carelessness, but instead you simply helped." Yates smiled, remembering that day by the creek that seemed both yesterday and a lifetime ago. "Best detour I ever took," he said softly, "leading me to you and to home." Their kiss was tender in the moonlight, a seal on promises made and a future unfolding before them. Behind them, the sounds of celebration continued, music and laughter, and the warm hum of community. Before them stretched the land they had defended together, now entering its season of renewal. The Gardner Calloway homestead would flourish in the years that followed. The stable Yates had built expanded to house more horses, which became the foundation of a successful breeding operation. The irrigation system that had sparked so much conflict proved its worth, allowing crops to thrive even in dry seasons. Samuel, freed from the daily demands of running the homestead, devoted himself to establishing a small school that served the children of surrounding properties. His classroom, initially just a corner of the new cabin he built for himself, eventually grew into a proper schoolhouse that became a center of community learning. Victor Harrington's trial ended with a conviction on lesser charges of intimidation and trespassing his wealth and connections, sparing him the full consequences of his actions. But his power in the region was permanently diminished. He eventually sold his Colorado holdings and returned to Texas, leaving the territory to those who valued community above dominance. Frank Winters documented it all in the El Dorado Sentinel, his editorials celebrating the triumph of determination and justice over greed and corruption. The story of the Gardner homestead and the rattlesnake that changed so many lives became part of local lore, told and retold with the embellishments that accompany all frontier tales. For Yates and Lily, the greatest joy came a year after their wedding, with the birth of their first child, a daughter with her mother's copper hair and her father's blue eyes. They named her Catherine, after the grandmother she would never meet, but whose spirit lived on in the family's resilience and love. As they stood together on the porch one evening, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold while their daughter slept peacefully inside, Lily voiced the thought that had been growing in her heart. "We should plant columbine along the creek," she suggested, "where we first met." A reminder of how something beautiful can grow from the most unexpected moments. Yates smiled, his arm tightening around her shoulders. "Seems fitting," he agreed, "though I doubt either of us needs reminding of that day." "No," she acknowledged, turning her face up to his. "Some memories are etched too deeply to ever fade." The rattlesnake that had struck beside her bare foot had long since disappeared into the wilderness, its momentary role in their story complete. But the words the cowboy had spoken, still as stone, "I'll move it off," had set in motion a chain of events that neither could have imagined in that tense moment by the creek. From danger had come salvation. From chance encounter, lasting love. From a homestead threatened, a legacy secured. It was, Yates often reflected, the way of the frontier, life and death, peril and promise, all bound together in the great unfolding story of the West. And in their small corner of that vast story, a former drifter and a courageous woman had found home in each other, a truth as enduring as the mountains that watched over their land, and as precious as the future they would build together.